Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are here in the John Hope Franklin Center. We are joined today by Daniel José Older, who is the author of 2 urban fantasy series, the Bone Street Rumba, the latest in the series being Hill Bolero, which was just published. It is an epic war based in Brooklyn. And he's also the author of the series Shadow Shapers. The title track, if you will, was a New York Times bestseller and notable book of the year. How are you doing?
I'm very happy. I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. We have some connective tissue.
Yes, indeed.
You know, Joan Morgan.
The great, legendary, epic Joan Morgan.
Yes. So shout out to Joan Morgan.
Absolutely.
You are also the co-editor of Long Hidden, Speculative Fiction in the Margins of History. So let's start with the speculative, fiction piece. A lot of folks now are talking about Octavia Butler. She's probably more famous now than she has been in a long time. You could go back and think about, some of the stuff that Du Bois was doing with Dark Princes in the 1920s. So there's been black folks doing speculative fiction for a long time. But suddenly now it's an in thing. You grew up in the Northeast, you grew up in Boston. When you were like 10, 12 years old, are you sitting there thinking about, I want to write fantasy novels? I mean, how did you get into this space?
No, and I'm glad you started with Octavia because that was really my entrance point. I was 10 and 12 years old. I was reading fantasy and loving fantasy, and without having the language for it, I was also acutely aware that I wasn't welcome in the genre. Because if anyone was there who represented me in any way, it was a clown or, a doomed sidekick or villain. You know what I mean? Like, Latinos don't pop up in there. Black folks don't pop up in there, except in terms of villainy and a joke.
I know growing up, as African American, and as I imagine was your experience also, there's always this big pressure on education, right? So you got to learn the reading and the writing and the arithmetic and that kind of thing. And so very often I think about my mother's choices for the kinds of books that she wanted me to read represented a certain kind of genre, right? She didn't want me to read comic books. How are you balancing, the kind of expectations of the stuff that your family wants you to read because they want you to grow up and be successful with your desire to read stuff that they might be looking at as like, what's that crazy shit you read?
Well, they were actually very cool about it. But my mom is a politics nerd. And so am I on the strength of that. So my other favorite book besides one of my favorite books was the Iliad, right? So they were really happy about that.
Well, I mean,
that's speculative fiction.
You know what I mean?
That's like the beginning.
We don't think
of
about it that way, but
totally. You got gods running around, determining the destinies of war, and it's like
big ass book too.
I loved that book though. I was so into it. Just gods and monsters and war and all this stuff.
I had an English teacher in high school. I went to Brooklyn Tech.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And the woman's name was Jastry. And she would perform the characters. I mean, it would freak us out. We're sitting there, and it's the only thing that made the book interesting to us. Because like she would get to these characters, and she would like just come alive. It's like, oh, okay.
Yes, see, that's great teaching. Which brings me to actually Mrs. Middleton. First of all, my other favorite book was All the President's Men.
Okay.
I was just like, I loved it, and it's also these like larger than life kind of characters.
So suspense, drama, intrigue,
and being very messed up and human in positions where they're supposed to be godlike, right? So there's there's so much conversation about power there, I think, which is fascinating. But then Mrs. Inez Middleton, I'm in 7th grade. She's the teacher that everyone's terrified of, but totally loves too. And she starts out like, if y'all mess up, I'm just gonna hang out and bite your toenails until you die. And we were all like, we believed her, so we're terrified, but we're in love. And she's huge and just happy and eats garlic all the time because she has a heart problem. And she takes me aside one day and gives me Bloodchild by Octavia Butler for no apparent reason. I mean, when I tell you teachers are magic, and she just gave me that book, and I don't know why. To this day, she passed, so I can never ask her. I don't know why. We became good friends, but I honestly just have no idea what she saw in me that was like, that kid's gonna grow up to write, badass people of color fantasy and sci-fi, so he needs some Octavia Butler in his life. And I read it, and it did blow my mind, but I didn't know what to do with it. Like, it was just like, what? Like, you can do this? And it really, I think of it as like either a time bomb or a seed planted, depending on what mood I'm in, that took, like 10 years, for me to go back and be like, oh, wait, Octavia Butler. Because I got away from fantasy because I was so just like dispirited with it because we're not there.
Yeah.
And then, I was just reading a lot of Baldwin and Bell Hooks and just trying to find like some truth about the world, in college. And then I graduated and I came back to fantasy and I was reading the Harry Potter, still being like, where the hell are we?
Where are we?
Great books, but where are we? White dudes are still saving the world, that's it?
Or fucking it up.
Oh, fucking it up. Yeah, exactly. Like more to the point. And then, I was working with some kids in Bushwick and they were reading Parable of the Sower. And then I was like, oh yeah, Octavia, oh shit, and then I just read everything that she wrote. So
tell me about this piece. I mean, everybody knows, who know you knows this part of your backstory, right? But you spent 10 years as a professional emergency services worker.
Yes, I did.
And I want to ask that question in the context of process.
Yeah.
When you're doing that kind of work on a daily basis as your job, are you setting aside time to write? Are you writing at all during this period of time? Like if you're on breaks,
literally,
yes. Are you sitting there like writing down notes in your little pad?
On the stretcher sometimes.
Yeah.
Like I would actually, like for real. It was like that. Like there was one unit I worked at the top of the Bronx. What's that park? I always forget the name of the park we would sit in, but way up by Riverdale.
Yeah.
And we would just sit in this dark park near a golf course all through the night. And it was quiet up there. Like it was a bunch of nursing homes. So we would just have a couple cardiac arrests, but in a 12-hour shift, that was it. So we like run off, do some CPR, jump back in the thing, come back to the park, just chill for hours.
Sitting there.
Yeah, I would bring my laptop and I would go in the back and I would hold up on the stretcher and just write Half Resurrection Blues. That's what I was doing.
It's interesting because we hear some of these narratives now. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of good writers, right, who are trust fund babies. Right, and somebody wrote them a check for them to take 18 months to find themselves and write a book and get it published. But when you talk about folks who are coming from working class backgrounds, right, who become writers, what you hear all the time are stories during lunch break.
Right.
If you got to ride the subway for longer than a half an hour, right, you sitting on the subway, right, taking notes and trying to write. It's such a different process.
That's true.
Right, than folks who have the time, who can go to a creative writing MFA.
Right, which I did much later on. Right. And I do come from, I think of my background as really privileged in the sense of education and just opportunities and resources. But definitely I had to work for a living, and I continued to. And it really did take about 10 years after college before I was like, you know what, I need to get an MFA, in part because I was ready to get off the ambulance. Yeah. And I was like, let me have that as kind of like what I'll do while I'm writing and I'm not working on the ambulance, I'm gonna teach.
Have any of those experiences,
all of them,
shown up now in some of your fiction?
Absolutely, but often not in the sense, not directly. So a lot of what I write, is about this bureaucracy of life and death, and how inhumane it really is. You know what I mean? Because in this series, in the Bone Street Rumba, there's this entity called the Council of the Dead, and they're basically there to regulate like what spirits get to be where, and they just bring all this nonsense and bullshit that is bureaucracy to this process that is supposed to be very natural and just true to who we are.
Sure a bunch of Republicans didn't read that?
And take notes, right?
Notes in terms of how
this
to
is a great idea,
Obamacare.
Right? Yo. And that's from
panels, yes.
That sounds like a great, right? Look, that's from working on the very, very real front line of life and death and dealing with bureaucracy, because you're there, I'm a healer. Like I'm there to heal somebody, but I have to deal with the different politics and paperwork and other bullshit that's involved with like being there, including like which technology we have, which we're allowed to use, like all this complex shit that has no business really being, literally business, being in the realm of healing, but is because of business.
The other thing that's pretty well known about your backstory, and we're here with Daniel José Older, talking about his work and his career, were the number of times that your work was rejected.
Yes.
That piece of it, right? And then the piece of being able to try to find an agent who understands you and understands the work. I mean, talk about those two dynamics in terms of you getting involved in the publishing industry.
Yeah, the publishing industry is a gauntlet, and that's true for every writer. There's no writer for which it's an easy ride, and you kind of don't want it to be, because you learn a lot in that process. But certainly, Shadow Shaper was the first book I wrote, and along the way it was rejected over 40 times. Went on to become a New York Times bestseller and New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Just garner lots of critical praise. But when I was trying to put it out and get it out there, no one was trying to hear my voice. And it's a very unapologetically Latino, and the character is Afro-Latina and proud and very clear on that. It deals directly with gentrification, with racism, with cultural appropriation, things like that, and street harassment. So it's a feminist, anti-racist fantasy book. And there's not a lot of those out there. You know, this is at a time when this was before We Need Diverse Books had busted out on the scene and really changed the game, right? So agents were reading it and just being like, well, you know, I don't know where we could sell this book. I don't know who would read it. Or they would say, I don't really identify with the main character. They don't really seem like someone I know, so boom. And I'm like, it's really not for you to identify with. I'm not writing for a 35-year-old, you know, white woman in Manhattan. This is a book that's for folks of color in Brooklyn or all over the world, you know. So this question of kind of universality and who we're supposed to be writing for and who's our audience, like all these come into play particularly when you're a writer of color, writing characters of color, trying to figure out how you're gonna maneuver through this gauntlet of an 80% white industry that, you know, you have to basically hope you find either the couple people of color up in there who are, you know, on it and most of them are just trying to hold on to their jobs. So they're not always in a good position to take risks, you know, or the woke ass white person. And that's what I ended up finding. It was a lot of, you know, like those are the editors that I work with are folks who know how to still give me really good editorial critique and know when to step back on the cultural piece when they're out of their lane. And that's a hard thing to find. So when I found them, I was like, you are my people. We are going to work together, you know, and do this.
You have this great line in an interview where you describe the publishing industry as like these white teen dystopias.
Right, like the Hunger Games. Right?
It's like the Hunger Games.
Because it's like they're really, you feel like you're being pit against all your other folks, which is really deep. Because we're still living in the era of quotas, by which I mean that every writer of color I know has had the rejection where they're like, the publisher's like, oh, you know, we already have our Chinese book this season.
Well, you know, it's a Ta-Nehisi Coates piece, right? You know, once Ta-Nehisi's out there and does what he does, it's like no one else can get in the space because, you know, we can only have one Ta-Nehisi at a time.
And that's so deep because that's also a very white fantasy trope that we're all contending with is the one and only, the one ring to rule them all, you know, the chosen one. All this bullshit, which goes all the way back to like the Bible and before. First of all, it's tired, it's a cliche. Second of all, we see how it plays out in the real world. And it's true in the models of success that we're given, which are very white models of like what it means to, this idea of like, you know, the lone kind of soldier that makes it above and blows up and is far away from their community, all this other unhealthy shit. You know, like for writers of color, we depend on our community for survival. Like it's all of us knowing each other and knowing, you know, and having that bond.
Sharing secrets.
Sharing secrets, mentoring each other. You know, it was mostly black women writers who really lifted me up. It was Cherie Renee Thomas who edited the Dark Matter anthology. That's amazing, you know, 100 years of speculative fiction from the African diaspora. Amazing stuff. Tanana Reeve Dew, Jackie Woodson. Like these are the writers who really like looked out for me and were like, you are telling stories that need to be told and here's how we're gonna help you.
And yet, you know, you could even argue that if you go back 10 years ago, right? Because, you know, 2005, I first met Sophia Quintero, you know, Black Artemis, right?
She's amazing.
And she's dealing with a very different kind of industry then, than you're dealing with now. So even in the context of what the challenges you're facing, there's been significant shifts in the last 10 years.
And there's been significant shifts in the last 3 years because of We Need Diverse Books and because people are now speaking out and just being really outrageous and taking risks. What I would say is that it's consistently the writers doing it. And we're consistently hearing like, oh, you know, we would like to help you, but, you know, we have our job to look out for. And I'm like, I too have a job to look out for. And I actually have to get rehired every time I write another book. You know what I mean? I have the least job stability in all of publishing. But we are seeing, you know, slowly like publishing professionals are speaking out more and being more outrageous. And that's amazing. Times are changing for sure.
How important has it been to think about that shift to the young adult audience?
Yeah, that's deep, right? Like, you know, I always think of the defining characteristic of young adult literature is really a question of the central crisis of the book, right? So if the book is about this young person being forced to step actively up into adulthood on some level and shed the mythology of childhood.
What does that look like for a 16-year-old?
What does that look like for a 16-year-old? And be it because they're coming up against ghosts or dragons or just, you know, terminal disease or whatever, because you know, that's across the board. It can be contemporary, it can be old fantasy, it can be urban fantasy, but it's really about like, are they growing up on some level? Is that the crisis of the book? And if not, then it's probably not a YA.
But you're also growing the next generation of these writers,
yes,
right? Because now you have 13 or 14-year-olds who are reading this stuff and can say, I see myself in this story.
Yes, and what I really hope to do is have them see it and be like, not only do I see myself in this story, but now I will tell my story, right? And like, because I've had so many young writers tell me they didn't think that their story mattered, and they'd never seen their story on the pages of a book. They'd never seen things like anti-blackness within the Latino community dealt with in the pages of a fantasy book, especially, right? So for them to see that and then be like, oh, we can do this. That's cool. Let's do it now. And that it's a viable, lifestyle and artistic endeavor that you can actually get paid to do. That's beautiful.
I would argue that the least creative thing that we could do right now is to describe the current era that we're in as the Trump era.
Oh, yes.
That is such low-hanging fruit. Right? So I refuse to give it a name yet.
I agree with you. Right? I'm fully, I don't even want to say his name.
To play out before we decide to name this particular moment.
Absolutely.
But given everything that's gone down in the last 6 months, of course, I don't know what your political persuasions are.
I think
I
you
can
could
imagine.
Guess. Yeah, I think you could probably surmise it pretty easily, but okay.
All of the shifts that we're seeing, everything from the person who is president, right? Everything from the person who is president to the conversations about fake news and what have you. Like I was struck, when as president-elect, he had his first press conference, and the BuzzFeed thing happened. And it's almost like you could imagine, from an editorial standpoint, if you're at BuzzFeed, you release whatever there is to release because that's the only way that you can have any kind of accountability in this moment, right?
Yeah,
that's the only hand that you can play.
Made perfect sense to me.
But then you're also wondering, is this move by BuzzFeed going to take it into Gawker land? Because of the way that folks are, and the BuzzFeed thing I think is smart because it speaks to a millennial audience in ways that the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal just fundamentally doesn't.
Absolutely.
But as you're looking at this dystopic moment,
very deeply dystopic moment,
how do you think it's going to impact your work going forward? Both in terms of the kind of stories that you choose to tell, but also in terms of issues around reception, and distribution, and all of those kinds of things.
I have no idea. I mean, and I've been thinking about it.
Has Netflix called you up yet?
The work has been optioned. Yeah, the work has been optioned, and in the process of it being optioned, one thing that I had to be really careful about was that it not get whitewashed. And that was sort of the first thing that I ever said to anyone who was involved in the work is, it's not going to be white people in this story because that's not what it's about. And
it can't be Ralph Fiennes,
playing
Michael Jackson.
It cannot be none of that shit.
Even if he actually looks more black than Michael Jackson.
Oh wow! You're on your own with that. You could Twitter handle him. All I know is, whitewashing is never okay, right? But particularly in a story that's about that very concept of being erased, of trying to survive and touch your culture and be a part of that. So that was just that's always been the bottom line for me as far as the movies happening. They will happen, but I can't, release any details yet. But I think if anything, it feels like the work I'm doing and the work a lot of my fellow, particularly writers of color, are doing is people are sort of waking up to see it as like being very much about this moment. I think I've been talking about this moment in a way my whole career. It's just become very alive and present in a way that people weren't quite ready for, and it really was a wake-up call. But the forces that brought Trump to power are the ones that have been going on this whole time. And as you know, there's, in a way it's brand new and outrageous, and in a way it's nothing new under the sun. And that's sort of what's so awful about it. But that's also what gives me hope, because I feel like the people that I know that have been doing the good work, as long as I've known them, and for all of our adult lives, we've been doing this work, whether it's working against police brutality, whether it's working around, getting the schools right and ending the school to prison pipeline, whether it's writing fantasy, that people of color can see ourselves in. That work continues. I remember being in a taxi in St. Louis the day after the election, and I asked the cab driver, you know, how you hanging with all this? And he was like, look, whoever won, I got to get up and go to work the next day.
Right.
And I was like, shit, that's true for
That's
us
real
too.
talk.
That's true
That's
for the
real
artists.
talk.
That's true for the organizers. We've been doing the work. If we're doing our job, we've been doing the work, and we're going to keep doing our work. It's going to change. Yes, the context is different. Strategy will have to change, and I'm sort of waiting to see what that's going to look like. But it's still going to be a conversation about dealing with the ugly legacy of this country and looking at the things that people in power are afraid to look at and making people uncomfortable so that the right people can get comfortable finally.
You're probably old enough to remember Tower Records.
Oh yeah, I love Tower Records.
And of course, the spot on 4th Street and Broadway.
The one in Boston was right off Newberry Street. I used to go there all the time.
So Tower, their little magazine, they had this thing in the back, Desert Island Disc, right? Ooh. So it's just you, and you need to get some writing done.
Oh man!
Give me 5 tracks.
Oh man!
What's on your playlist?
I'm so mad at you. Okay. Wow. Okay, let me think. Okay, first of all, there's this track, I always forget I'm terrible with names, but there's a Mos Def track that I just adore and worship. Is it called Rise? It's the one where he's singing about people rising up into the night. And it's just so damn beautiful. You know, I just love that song. Again, I'm terrible with names. So that, let me see. You know, Angel Hayes, I don't know if you've been on their work, but they just be doing that good shit consistently. Like, that's my favorite rapper right now. One track, I don't know, the whole album of Back to the Woods, but I guess that title song is it. There's so much good stuff on there. Babe Ruthless. So yeah, definitely them. Radiohead.
Okay.
Radiohead did this joint for the last James Bond movie, and they didn't use it. It's called Spectre. And they did a title track for them, and it's bananas. And for whatever dumbass reason, they decided not to go with it, but Radiohead released it. It's so haunting and beautiful. Like, it's incredible. So that. Let's see. You know, there's so much. I'm going through my Cuban stack right now in the back of my mind, and there's just so much good. There's this group called the Trio Matamoros, and I actually use one of their songs as the kind of centerpiece of this book. They have a song called El Trio y el Ciclón. That's this old Cuban song about them living through this really messed up hurricane in Dominican Republic. And it's beautiful, also beautiful and haunting, and just kind of everything. So I'll go with that. Okay. Yeah.
We've been joined by Daniel José Older. This is the latest book, Battle Hill Bolero, just published. Thank you for joining us here on the Left of Black set.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black